I'm running a group program right now, and some great questions have been coming in that echo questions that I get frequently. And so I'd love to share them here if you're curious about breath work, want to dive deeper. So here we go. If you have ever experienced a breathwork journey where you're cycling your breath through and it's an activating breathwork journey where you start to have heightened sensations, heightened prana, life force energy in yogic terms, and even emotions, movements of emotions. Sometimes it's very common in that style of breathing to start to, at some point, excessively yawn. This is a multi-tiered thing. So let me start by saying this. Science can establish that yawning is indicative of a shift in the nervous system. If you think about it, when you wake up in the morning, you might yawn as the body starts to wake up and get ready for the day. On the other end, you might yawn at the end of the day when your body's starting to downshift before sleep. So whether your nervous system is shifting up or shifting down, yawns can occur. Here's the thing about yawning that can get really interesting when it comes to more deep layers of the nervous system where you may be carrying some things. I sometimes refer to stress or negative energy as a kind of parasite. What I mean when I say that, and you may take that literally, I'm meaning it metaphorically. If you think of negative energy as a parasite, what is a parasite's job? To stay connected to the host. So if you are carrying some sort of negative energy and you start a certain process, like an energy clearing breathing pattern, or and you sustain the breathing pattern. Everybody's got their own ways of doing it, but the point being, as the breath starts to sweep through, it may start to activate areas where you're carrying some negative energy, so to speak. And as you do, and this will, I will tell you up front, sound very unscientific, but anything I share, particularly the things that are unscientific sounding, are coming from years of experience in my own practice, supported by years of experience in other clients that I'm witnessing in their practice. And so there are these through lines that emerge that are undeniable. So in the context of excessive yawning, it could very simply be that you are excessively tired, right? That your nervous system is just, like you're starting this breathing pattern, but your nervous system is just tired. It could be that you're yawning as your nervous system is shifting and there's a sort of opening experience that's happening as you're yawning. But very often when the yawning is excessive, it's indicative of tapping into deeper layers where some negative energy might be living. And as you do, if you think of negative energy as a parasite, as you tap into that negative energy, whether you realize consciously or unconsciously, as your body's starting to tap into those deeper layers of energy, you may start to find some excessive yawning happening. And in that case, in that context, the yawning may be a sort of distraction or avoidance, a way that the parasite is hanging on. And again, I know that if there are enough people interested in this video and this conversation, there may even be comments that come in as like, that's the most unscientific thing I've ever heard. It is very common. I've experienced it myself and I see it with others. And so often, if you can continue to breathe through the excessive yawning, which may sound funny, you might think, oh, in order to yawn, I have to stop this breathing pattern. Not true. You can yawn while you're keeping the breath moving. And so for people who stay with it, they often find there is a deeper layer to tap into where some emotion sits or some emotion is living. As you tap into those deeper layers and access the potential negative energy that you may be carrying, the excessive yawning tends to shift. Other people experience the excessive yawning and it's sort of a way out, right? It's kind of a barrier that doesn't allow getting into the deeper layers. And I'm here to say that neither of those is right or wrong. Sometimes this more intensive energy clearing style of breath work can be just that, very intensive. And there's nothing valuable in pushing past what we feel safe to explore. And that's where a supportive facilitator comes in. That's where the most important thing to know before you go into any intensive breath work is to know how to have agency over your experience. So if you experience something like excessive yawning or overwhelming feelings, sensations, emotions, You know how to modulate your experience so that you're only going as far as you feel ready to, which is to say, establishing a foundation where your feet are firmly rooted underneath you, metaphorically speaking, because at least in my sessions, you're lying down while you're doing this. But that metaphorical sense of your feet being firmly established underneath you, you're starting to deep dive with the breath. And as things start to arise, you notice them, you breathe into the feelings. And if at any point you start to feel your feet not under you and you start to feel overwhelmed or excessively fearful in some form or fashion, you can slow things down and get your feet back under you. And then as you feel ready to, you can start to deep dive with the breath again, right? But maintaining your feet under you, because I'll say this one other thing about this. If you are to go deep into your experience, so deep that you don't feel your feet under you, you feel a lot of overwhelm, even if you have a big movement of emotion, some sort of catharsis, just because you have a big feeling, if you don't have a foundation, the feeling of your feet under you, and you have a big catharsis or movement of emotion, it could be anything from not particularly useful because you're not able to integrate it, all the way up to potentially re-traumatizing because you don't feel a sense of agency or your feet rooted underneath you. So, a lot to say about yawning, but one of the most impactful things about it is sometimes it's indicative, it's an avoidance tactic that, metaphorically speaking, negative energy as a parasite is hanging on, and this is a usually unconscious way to sort of avoid the deeper emotion. That's one possibility, and a common one at that. Breathwork while menstruating. So just a quick touch on this here. I only have one simple thing to say about this. There is research that supports that calm breathing patterns. So broadly speaking, anything in and out through the nose, where you're breathing down deep into your low belly, nose, belly, slow, as I like to say, 3 pillars of calm breathing. So you can get more technique oriented with that. You can be much more specific with that, but broadly speaking, nose, belly, slow. There is science to support that engaging in calm breathing patterns during menstruation is incredibly supportive, can lessen symptoms. It, of course, regulates your nervous system and the whole cascade of downstream positive effects from that. On the other end, when we talk about these more activating, energy clearing, so to speak, breathwork sessions, I typically refer to them as somatic breathwork journeys. When it comes to that style of breathwork during menstruation, be aware of what's going on. In the same way that it's easy to do too much activating breath work as it pertains to being too heightened in your emotions where it feels out of control or uncomfortable or overwhelming. Not dissimilarly here, breath work during menstruation, doing activating intensive breath work during menstruation, it's not necessarily a contraindication where it's just an absolute no, but people who have very intensive menstruation processes, as I do not personally have experience with myself, but I have experience with clients who do have intensive menstruation processes and experiences. Go easy, calm breathing, always good and supportive. Intensive breath work, tread lightly, explore, notice what feels good. Also, feel free to take a break and come back to it when your symptoms are more relaxed. The last one here that I want to get to that applies to all of us. If you're a human being on the planet Earth, you know what stress is. And in one sense, stress is a big catch-all term, and there are different ways to define stress. But in terms of the feeling, we all have a sense of what it is. I once heard it referred to that stress is a result of changes in our environments, which I think is a pretty interesting way to think of it, because in that sense, and this will get me to the main point of this, if stress is a result of changes in our environments, then even good changes bring stress. So that begs the question, is stress good or bad? Stress is widely attributed as one of the leading causes of all kinds of horrible things that lead to ultimately death, right? Heart attacks, you name it. You go down the line. So in one sense, stress is the number one killer in a way. In another sense, stress is the number one thing that leads to our positive growth and transformation. There's post-traumatic stress disorder. There's post-traumatic growth. It is a multi-tiered, multi-layered topic, and with full sensitivity to the wide range under the umbrella of stress, which it can include anything from day-to-day traffic to training for a marathon to trauma to pain to loss to abuse. This wide umbrella of stress can be anything, again, from hurtful to you, your body, your system, your state of mind, to immensely helpful. This also makes me think of a phrase a teacher of mine once shared, which was, you don't even have to like what you're grateful for. Because sometimes our greatest growth comes from our deepest pain. So let me get more specific here. There was one other definition that I found really interesting, which was something to the effect of stress as a result of when we deeply care about something, right? When something really matters, we tend to feel stress around that. If we don't care about something or it doesn't really matter, it doesn't tend to affect us in stress, good or bad, quite frankly. So, okay, to get very specific here, it appears perception of our own stress has a direct correlation to whether the stress we're experiencing is negative for us or positive for us. I'll say that again in a slightly different way. Our perception of our own stress creates the difference of whether a stressor takes us out at the knees and cuts us down, or helps us grow, transform, rise above our circumstances or the situation we're in. And not only is that conceptual, apparently, our perception of stress has the effect of whether our body primarily releases cortisol, which ultimately breaks us down. It has its function, but cortisol is a stress hormone that, when in excess, ultimately breaks us down. Or if we change our perception of our stress to see it as a positive growth activator, then our body tends to release more DHEA, which contributes to positive. Not only our positive perception releases more DHEA relative to the amount of cortisol. So cortisol breaks us down. DHEA contributes to growth. So there are literal chemical processes within our body that are the downstream effect of our perception. I would imagine this is true on so many levels, in so many ways. How we perceive our experience seems to have a direct chemical byproduct of how our body feels our experience, which has, again, a whole cascade effect of health results, you could say, consequences in the negative sense, and beautiful outcomes in the positive sense. And it can be the same stressor, the very same stressor that cuts you down at the knees, with a shift in perspective, could be the stressor that helps you grow, transform, heal, and ultimately even contribute to you sharing your story and contribute to other people's healing. It starts with perception. And I'm very careful to be sensitive to this, because this is, depending on the stressor, far easier said than done. You know, you can reference, I got a flat tire on the side of the highway that sent me into a tailspin of stress. Well, okay, that might be something that's like, all right, well, what are the circumstances? Depending on the circumstances, that could be mildly inconvenient to horrific, right? Depending on any number of factors, like infinite factors, right? But if you're the type of person that experiences a flat tire on the side of the highway, but it's the middle of the day, you're in a safe enough spot, there's a nice wide shoulder, maybe you have AAA and they're on their way, you just gotta wait. Maybe, yeah, you have a meeting to get to, but you were running early, so you'll probably still make it on time, whatever. This could be stressful, but depending on what type of person you are, it might throw you for a tailspin. Or you might laugh about it. Or you might say, hey, there's a wide shoulder over here. I'm safe where my car is. Let me see if this is an opportunity to learn how to change a tire and to build my resilience, my self-reliance. And you take this perspective that it's a positive thing. It actually has a downstream effect of whether you release primarily cortisol into your system, which again, over time can contribute to breakdown physically, health-wise. Or if you take a positive perspective on it, you can ultimately release more, in this case, DHEA, which causes growth to your brain to be supportive of your body. I don't mean to speak out of turn here. I'm referencing a study that I have a very surface layer knowledge of, but the impact and the implications are absolutely profound, that your perception changes your experience of your physical experience of your life. Whether you close down and you get whittled away, or whether you open up and expand and feel empowered. It starts with your perception. Last thing I'll say here, I am not interested in toxic positivity. I am not interested in trying in me or anyone else, anyone else, convincing yourself that something's okay or positive when it is absolutely not. There are times in which you can say, well, if I don't perceive this as good or bad, I just see the opportunity for growth here. Absolutely. There are also times when good or bad are very important to delineate, times when you need to speak up for yourself, times when you need to say to somebody or some situation, hey, it's time to back off and put a firm boundary. There are times for all these things, but coming back to the fact that your perception of your stress can shape your fundamental health, mental and physical health, by changing your perspective. So I'll leave you with this. The next time you're experiencing stress, that feeling of stress on any level and for any reason, if you can, create some space to get curious. What happens if I find a glimmer of how this might turn into a growth opportunity? And see if you can keep pulling that thread, see if you can keep breathing into that feeling of perceiving your stress as a growth opportunity, and rather than being cut down by it. And again, for the last time, I'll say, much easier said than done, depending on the situation. I am fully aware of that. My thoughts and support are with you, depending on what you're moving through and going through. This can be a wide range of experience, but just to say, see what you notice by shifting your perspective. Victory to the light within.